Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder. And last time, Washington captured Boston and moved his army to New York City to await the British. Now we join Washington as the British make landfall. If you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. The British General William Howe was also appointed a peace commissioner. He dispatched a naval officer to deliver a letter to Washington. Joseph Reed would meet the officer. The conversation went as such. "I have a letter, sir, from Lord Howe to Mr. Washington." Reed replied, "There is no such person in the army. I cannot receive a letter for General Washington under such direction." The officer asked what title would Washington accept. It was concluded that he would be addressed as General Washington. Once the debate over title was resolved, Washington met with Howe's adjutant general in the headquarters of Henry Knox on Broadway. General Howe and his brother Admiral Richard Howe were limited in what they could say as peace commissioners, at least until the colonists had surrendered and acknowledged the supremacy of Parliament. When Washington and his adjutant general met, the British officer wanted to open negotiations toward a peace. Washington informed him that he didn't have the power to conduct those talks. When Washington wanted to discuss American prisoners of war in Canada, the Howes didn't have jurisdiction over that area, so the talks ended with nothing important transpiring. On July 9, 1776, Washington officially learned of the Declaration of Independence. That evening, he assembled his army on the parade grounds, and officers read the document to the men to lift morale. Afterward, the officers read a statement from Washington declaring that independence rested solely on the success of the army. Sickness within the British army delayed the attack that Washington anticipated. Sickness also plagued his own troops. One of his commanders, Nathaniel Greene, became seriously ill and needed replaced with a British attack imminent. Washington chose John Sullivan to take Greene's place. On August 22nd, the British fleet began landing troops on Long Island. Washington didn't contest the landing. He felt more comfortable using the terrain to his advantage, and the beach afforded him no advantage. So he waited. Reports came in that 8,000 enemy troops landed on Long Island. Fearing a feint, Washington kept his troops ready but didn't move them. After a few days, the general became concerned about the situation. What were the British doing, he wondered. Washington crossed over to Long Island himself to personally examine the beachhead. The information given to him was wrong. Around 16,000 troops landed, twice the number reported. Washington hoped that the defenses on Long Island would hold against a British assault, but numerous roads needed to be guarded in order to prevent the British from working their way around the fortifications. At midnight on August 27th, the Redcoats, led by local Tories, found those roads and came in behind the American forces. An attack was made in their front as a diversion. Then the British slammed their traps shut, killing around 300 patriots and capturing nearly 1,000. General Howe now had the option to assault what was left of the Americans' fortifications or lay siege to them. Howe decided to lay siege even though it would take longer. It was better than wasting lives like had been done at Bunker Hill under his generalship. Washington now had a decision to make: stay and fight on Long Island behind what fortifications were left, or retreat. A council of war yielded the best answer: withdraw to Manhattan. A fog rolled in which covered their movements. Every available sloop and flat-bottomed boat was brought in to ferry the men across the river. In 8 hours, over 9,000 soldiers were evacuated off the island without losing a single man. A few weeks went by as Washington and Howe formulated their plans for the next phase of the campaign. Washington believed that Howe would attack near the plains of Harlem, but Howe's plan was to assault the fortifications at Kips Bay, around 4 miles south of Harlem. British ships bombarded the American entrenchments, scattering the Patriot forces, paving the way for the Hessian Jaegers to advance virtually unopposed. Washington heard the blast from the cannons and rode south to see what was developing. The general seized with rage when he saw officers and men running for their lives. He became so enraged that he beat the men as they ran by with his riding crop, but nothing would stop the men from retreating to safety. Amidst his beatings, a group of 70 Hessians began approaching. Washington was too angry to notice them, so a staffer had to grab the general's horse's reins and led them away. The next day, Washington fought the Battle of Harlem Heights, a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. It gave confidence to Washington, who had watched his soldiers run away from battle at Kips Bay. At Harlem Heights, they stood and fought with the discipline of British regulars. During the fight, Joseph Reed, Washington's adjutant general, came across a man running for the rear. Reed blocked his route. The soldier lifted his rifle and pulled the trigger, but the gun misfired. Reed pulled his weapon and pulled the trigger, but it also misfired. Reed then unsheathed his sword and slashed the soldier about the head and cut off his thumb before having him arrested. He was court-martialed and sentenced to death, but rumor of a mutiny began to swirl if the soldier was executed, claiming that he was going to the rear to get his unit ammunition. Washington called off the execution. Washington's confidence in his troops, now that he saw them fight the British without retreating, nearly caused a disaster for the Patriots. Instead of moving off Manhattan Island, which could easily be surrounded by British forces on land and sea, he remained at Harlem Heights, confident that he could fight back against a British attack. However, General Howe began to seal off the water routes for the Continentals, and then landed a force at Throg's Neck. The island surrounded by marsh was a miserable location for the British troops to traverse, so much so that 25 Pennsylvania riflemen, the only men in that sector, held off the British troops on Throg's Neck and convinced Howe to change his disembarking location. Washington's generals agreed that they needed to evacuate Manhattan Island, with Howe striking so far north in order to cut them off from supplies. The British eventually landed at Pell's Point and struck for White Plains, but Washington's army beat them there by 6 days. On October 28th, the British attacked Washington's good position and suffered for the attempt. The Continentals held up great under fire, and although they eventually withdrew in good order, it stalled the British. After the Battle of White Plains, Washington waited for the next attack, fully prepared to defend his position at White Plains, but the British began to retreat. Howe and the army were headed south back to Manhattan. Washington pondered what the British general could have in mind, but thought he may strike for New Jersey. Leaving most of his force around White Plains, he set off for New Jersey with 2,000 men. Before leaving New York, he visited Fort Washington on Manhattan Island and had a decision to make. Should he evacuate the fort and take those forces to New Jersey with him, or see if they could obstruct the British? The fort contained around 3,000 soldiers. On November 16th, Howe made Washington's decision for him. As the Continental commander was about to inspect the fort, Howe launched his attack, carrying the fort and taking over 2,800 Patriot prisoners. The constant retreating and losses in combat wore on Congress and soldiers. Joseph Reed, Washington's adjutant general, began to wonder about the entire war effort. He reached out to General Charles Lee, telling him that Washington would be better off with him nearby to give him proper advice. Reed knew that Washington took the advice of Nathanael Greene to not abandon Fort Washington and wanted a general he trusted with the commander. Lee wrote back to Reed when he was away from Washington's headquarters, now in New Jersey. Washington got the letter, and although it was addressed to Reed, opened it to see where Lee was with his troops who were to join Washington in New Jersey. When he opened the letter and read the contents, his heart sank. He felt that Reed didn't trust him as commander of the Continental Army. He wondered if this was an attempt to oust him from command. Washington wrote Reed a letter explaining he had opened the note and been hurt by it. Reed would stay with Washington, but the relationship was never the same. In New Jersey, Washington didn't find the troops he hoped to find. Militias were supposed to flock to his army there, but not enough came. He appealed for Lee to join him in New Jersey. He wrote, "I confess I expect you would have been sooner in motion. 4 days later, I must entreat you to hasten your march." Another 2 days went by. "You will readily agree that I have sufficient cause for my anxiety and to wish your arrival as early as possible." A week later, General Howe is pressing forward. "I cannot but request and entreat you to march and join me with all possible expedition." The next day, "I must therefore entreat you to push on with every possible succor you can bring." 3 days later, "It is painful to me to add another word upon the subject. Let me once more request and entreat you to march immediately." Up to a point, Lee's delay was understandable. All the supply deficiencies that Washington felt, Lee also felt. A lack of shoes and equipment delayed him, but once he entered New Jersey, Lee began to take matters into his own hands. He decided to attack the rear of the British army, facing Washington, but this was disobeying orders. He was to join Washington. In mid-December, Lee ventured away from his army to visit a tavern with 15 soldiers as his escort. A British scouting party overpowered his guards and took him prisoner. Lee was now taken out of the campaign, and his second-in-command, John Sullivan, was placed at the head of his command. A week later, Sullivan joined up with Washington. British General Charles Cornwallis commanded a 4,000-man force that chased after Washington through New Jersey. At first, Cornwallis moved at a rapid pace, exhausting his men and animals, sometimes moving 20 miles per day. As Washington moved towards Trenton, he burned every bridge he came to slow down the British forces. Howe and Cornwallis entered Trenton as Washington and the Patriots crossed the Delaware River to avoid their pursuers. Washington placed troops at 4 major river crossings and waited. He would write, "We wander in a wilderness of uncertainties and difficulty."